He tore my wedding dress in church and left me naked at the altar. What no one expected was that my mother-in-law would be my salvation. For 30 years, that religious family's secret destroyed lives until my humiliation exposed the hidden truth. Hello, my dears. What a joy to have you here with me today. I'm Eleanor Jenkins Thompson, 78 years young, and I'm coming to you from Seabreeze, a lovely little coastal town in North Carolina. Today, I live in a simple house, but with a garden full of flowers in the front yard. Those colorful ones that brighten the heart of everyone who passes by. I have my begonias, my daisies, and my sunflowers that face the sun all day long, as if they're smiling at the sky. Every morning I wake up early, even before the sun appears. I like to prepare my hot coffee with that homemade bread I make myself. The recipe is from my late mother, God rest her soul. Afterward, I go tend to my plants, water each one with great care. It's like they're my children too, Each has its own little way. Some need more water, others more shade. In the afternoon, my grandchildren come to visit me. There are 6 in all. The oldest ones are already in college, imagine that. And the youngest ones are still in elementary school. I teach them how to embroider, tell old stories, and sometimes we make cookies together. Gabriella, my 8-year-old granddaughter, says she wants to learn all of Grandma's secrets to teach to her children someday. Isn't that sweet? I started telling my stories when my grandson Teddy asked me to talk about what life was like when I was a young girl. He had a school assignment about family memories and wanted to know how Grandma lived. At first, I only told the beautiful things, But then, with time, I understood that our pain teaches too, and that the scars I carry might help others avoid the same suffering. I'm sitting here in my patchwork armchair with my crochet in my lap and my cat Romeo sleeping at my feet. The window is open, and you can smell the ocean mixed with the garden flowers. It's from here that I'll tell you a story I kept for many years. Before I begin, if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel, I'd be very grateful. That's how more people can hear our stories and perhaps find comfort in this old grandma's words. And you, my dears who are watching now, tell me in the comments, what town are you watching from? And what time of day did you find this video? Are you having your morning coffee, or perhaps after lunch, or maybe in the evening before bed? I love reading all the comments and knowing where people come from who take a moment of their day to listen to this grandma's stories. Let me know, okay? Let's create a chain of affection. Today I'm going to tell you about the day that should have been the happiest of my life, but which turned into the beginning of a difficult journey. It's a story about betrayal, where you least expect it, and about how, sometimes, the person who comes to save you is the one you least imagine. I was born and raised in Millfield, a small town in Western Virginia, near the border with West Virginia. It was a tiny place where everyone knew everyone. My father, Gerald Jenkins, was a hard-working man, one of those who woke up with the chickens and only returned home when the sun had long since set. He had a general store in town, selling a bit of everything: grains, fabrics, tools. We weren't rich, but food never lacked on our table. My mother, Alice Jenkins, was a seamstress. Good heavens, what blessed hands that woman had! She made wedding dresses that looked like they came from magazines, even though she never studied for it. She learned from her mother, my grandmother Eleanor, who was also a seamstress. It was a gift that passed from mother to daughter, like a precious inheritance. We were 4 siblings. I was the only girl, the youngest, born after 3 boys. Paul, the oldest, was always my father's right-hand man at the store. Eric, the middle one, was a teacher at the local school. And Oliver, who came before me, was the only one who left town. He went to study medicine in Richmond and ended up staying there. Being the only girl and the youngest, I was my father's little darling, but also the one who helped my mother the most with household chores and with the sewing. Our house was simple, but very cozy. It had 3 bedrooms, one for my parents, one for the boys, and one just for me, which was the smallest of all, but I loved it. The walls were wooden, painted light blue, and the roof made a huge noise when it rained heavily, like it was going to collapse. In the backyard, we had a huge apple tree, a peach tree, and several chickens that scratched around all day long. My childhood days were full of work, but also joy. I woke up early to help my mother make breakfast for my father and brothers. Then I went to school. I studied at Millfield Elementary, which was about a 20-minute walk from our house. I remember that in winter, which was harsh there in the mountains, my hands would be so cold I could barely hold the pencil when I arrived. After school, I helped my mother with the dresses. First, just threading needles and sorting buttons. As I grew older, I learned to sew too. By 10, I knew how to do hems and sew on buttons. By 12, I was helping embroider details on wedding dresses. It was work that required patience, but filled me with pride when I saw the brides leaving our house looking beautiful to get married in the little church in town. My childhood girlfriends were few, but very dear. Dorothy, the pharmacist's daughter, who was the same age as me. Nancy, who lived next door and came to play with me after we finished our chores. And Catherine, who was a bit older and already dreamed of being a teacher like my brother Eric. We played Ring Around the Rosie in the churchyard, hide and seek among the trees in the square, and with dolls that my mother made for us. On weekends, when I wasn't helping at home, we'd go to the Millfield Creek, which ran close to town. There, we'd sit on the bank, with our feet in the water, talking about the dreams we had for the future. The entire town revolved around the church. The pastor was the most respected person in Millfield. Sunday services were sacred, nobody dared miss them, and the festival for the patron saint, Saint Mary of Grace, was the most anticipated event of the year. The whole town would be decorated, the women would make treats, the men would organize games, and the band would play in the square. It was pure joy. It was in this little town, in this environment of faith and work, that I grew up listening to stories of princesses who found their princes and lived happily ever after. My mother, while sewing the wedding dresses, would tell these stories, and I dreamed of the day when I would wear one of these dresses and find my Prince Charming. But it was also in this little town that I began to notice strange things a girl shouldn't understand so early. I remember once, I must have been about 11, when a girl named Teresa returned to town after going away to study. She was different, quiet, with a sad look. People whispered when she passed by, and my mother would pull me away when we saw her on the street. One day, I asked my mother why Teresa was so sad and why people talked about her. My mother only replied, "Some people hurt young women, Eleanor. People who should protect, but who hurt instead. When you're a young lady, never be alone with any man, even if it's someone everyone respects." I didn't really understand at the time, but I kept that advice with me. Another strange sign was the way some women looked at the ground when the pastor passed by. It wasn't just respect, it seemed like fear. And how some mothers never let their daughters go to Bible study alone. There was always a mother, an aunt, an older sister along. I thought it was just overprotection, but later I would understand that it was much more than that. Life took its course, and I grew up among my mother's wedding dresses, games with friends, school duties, and Sunday services. I dreamed of my wedding day, with the dress my mother would make for me, the church all decorated, and the young man who would wait for me at the altar. Little did I know that this dream would turn into a nightmare that would mark my life forever, but that would also bring me a strength I never imagined I had. When I turned 17, my life took a turn. My brother Oliver, who was already established as a doctor in Richmond, invited me to live with him and his wife. He said that in Charlottesville, a neighboring city where he also worked, there was a nursing technical school, and that I could study there. My parents, after much discussion, agreed. They wanted a better future for their youngest daughter. It was with a heavy heart that I left Millfield. My mother gave me a rosary as a gift and told me to pray every day and stay on God's path. My father gave me some money and a piece of advice. Trust your heart first before trusting any person, even if that person wears a clerical collar. I arrived in Charlottesville in March 1964. It was a bigger city than Millfield, with more movement, more people. In the first few days, I felt lost, missing my family, my friends, even the apple tree in the backyard. But soon, I began to adapt. The nursing course was demanding, but I enjoyed learning to care for people. It was at nursing school that I met Susan, a girl from Staunton who became my best friend. It was she who accompanied me on the way home, who helped me with my studies, who took me to get to know the city on weekends. And it was she who introduced me to her brother, Michael, on a Sunday in May during lunch at her parents' house. Michael worked at a bank, was 3 years older than me, and had the kindest eyes I'd ever seen in my life. We talked the whole Sunday, and I returned to my brother's house with butterflies in my stomach. In the following weeks, he began to visit me, always bringing a little chocolate or a little flower. My brother Oliver approved of the courtship. He said that Michael was a young man from a good family with a future. Our courtship was like a dream. He respected me, waited for me at the end of school, took me to have ice cream in the square. When we completed 6 months of dating, he gave me a little promise ring, and when it was a year, he took me to a restaurant by the river and asked for my hand in marriage. "I want to build a life with you, Eleanor," he said with those sincere eyes. "I want to have children with you, grow old by your side." How could I say no to such a request? We set the wedding for 6 months from then, enough time to organize everything, and for my mother to sew my wedding dress. Oh, my dress. My mother came from Millfield, especially to take the measurements. It was white satin, with pearl embroidery on the bodice and a train that dragged for almost 6 feet. Each pearl was sewn by hand, each detail thought out with care. My mother said she was making the most beautiful dress of her entire life. The chosen church was St. Christopher's Cathedral, the most beautiful in Charlottesville. Michael was an active member of the community, participated in youth groups, helped with church festivals. Everyone knew and respected him. The pastor of the parish, Pastor Richard Wilson, was an elderly gentleman with white hair and a jovial manner. He had known Michael's family for years. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I had to go to the church several times to sort out details of the ceremony. The first time, I went with Michael. In the following ones, as he was busy at the bank, I went alone. It was on one of these visits that I met Pastor Luke Sullivan, Pastor Richard's nephew, who had recently arrived from Boston. He was a tall man, about 40, with a deep voice and a way of looking that made me uncomfortable. He would be responsible for our ceremony, since Pastor Richard was in fragile health. I remember as if it were today the first time I was alone with Pastor Luke. I went to the vestry to deliver the list of songs we wanted in the ceremony. He closed the door and sat very close to me. "So you're Michael's bride," he said, looking at me in a way that made me want to run out of there. Such a beautiful young woman. He's a lucky man. I thanked him awkwardly and tried to change the subject, talking about the songs. He agreed with the choices but kept looking at me in a strange way. When I got up to leave, he held my arm. "Have you confessed for the wedding?" he asked. I replied that I hadn't yet. "Come confess with me," he insisted. "I need to make sure you're pure enough for Michael." I left there with a knot in my stomach, remembering my father's advice. I told Michael about the discomfort I felt, but he minimized the situation. "Pastor Luke is highly respected," said Michael. "He studied at Harvard Divinity School, comes from an important family in the city. It must just be his manner, a bit formal because of the time he spent in Boston." I trusted Michael, but decided I wouldn't confess with Pastor Luke. Instead, I went to a neighboring parish where nobody knew me and made my confession there. I didn't tell this to anyone. I thought it was better that way. The weeks went by and the wedding day approached. My parents arrived in Charlottesville 2 days before. My mother brought the dress, which was even more beautiful than I had imagined. The night before the wedding, we had a small gathering at Michael's parents' house. It was there that I met his mother, Mrs. Sarah Thompson. She was a quiet woman, of few words. While everyone was chatting animatedly about the next day's party, She remained silent, with a rosary between her fingers. At a certain point, she approached me and, without anyone noticing, squeezed my hand tightly. "May God protect you tomorrow, my child," she said with an expression that mixed fear and resignation. I thought it was strange, but thought it was just the nervousness of seeing her son getting married. On the morning of the wedding, I woke up with my heart racing. My friends from nursing school came to help me get ready. Susan, who would be my maid of honor, couldn't stop smiling and saying that I would be the most beautiful bride Charlottesville had ever seen. When I put on that dress that my mother had made with so much love, I looked in the mirror and could hardly believe it. It was as if a dream was coming true. The pearl embroidery shimmered in the sunlight coming through the window. The veil fell like a cascade over my shoulders. I was radiant, ready to start a new life beside the man I loved. We arrived at St. Christopher's Cathedral at 3 p.m. sharp. The car that took me, all decorated with white flowers, stopped in front of the entrance. My father helped me get out and offered his arm to lead me down the aisle. The church was packed. It seemed like half of Charlottesville was there. The white flowers adorned the pews, the organ played the wedding march, and there at the front, near the altar, was Michael, handsome in his dark suit, waiting for me with a nervous smile. When I reached the altar, my father handed my hand to Michael, and I felt that my life was about to change forever. What I didn't know was how much, nor in what way. Pastor Luke began the ceremony. His deep voice echoed through the church as he spoke about the duties of matrimony. At a certain point, he announced that we would take a break for the signing of the registers in the vestry before the final vows. That wasn't in the script we had agreed on, but since I wasn't very familiar with the procedures, I didn't question it. "The groom and the witnesses can wait here," said the pastor. "The bride must accompany me for a special moment of preparation." Michael smiled and squeezed my hand, as if encouraging me to go. My maid of honor, Susan, seemed concerned, but didn't say anything. I followed Pastor Luke to the back of the church, passing through the vestry. He walked quickly, as if in a hurry. We reached a small corridor that I had never seen before, away from the main area. "Before the final vows, we need to ensure that you are ready," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Here, enter this room to touch up your makeup. We don't want a bride with a shiny face in the photos, do we?" He opened a door that led to a small private bathroom, the kind that only pastors use. It was a cramped space, with a sink, a small mirror, and some hooks on the wall. I entered, thinking it would be quick, that I would just glance in the mirror and return to the altar, to my Michael. That's when I heard the sound of the door closing behind me and the click of the lock. When the door closed behind me, I heard Pastor Luke's breathing change. That man who moments before was conducting the most important ceremony of my life with a solemn voice, now breathed as if he had run a marathon. I turned slowly and saw him leaning against the door, looking at me in a way that froze my blood. "Pastor, I think we should go back. Michael and the guests are waiting," I said, trying to stay calm, while my heart was beating so hard it felt like it would come out of my mouth. "Don't rush, my child," he replied, with a smile that had nothing holy about it. "Before delivering a bride to her husband, I need to make sure she is prepared." He took a step in my direction, and I backed up until I felt the cold sink against my back. There was nowhere to go in that tiny bathroom. The smell of cologne coming from his suit mixed with a breath of wine made me nauseous. "You're scaring me," I said, my voice already trembling. "Please, let me out." That's when he raised his hand and ran his fingers over my veil, then over my face. "So beautiful, so pure. You know I can cancel this wedding with a word, don't you? I can say that you're not in condition, that you're not worthy." I felt the world spin around me. How could this be happening? In the church, on my wedding day, with a man who was supposed to be of God. I tried to control myself, to think clearly. Michael and the guests were just a few meters away in the nave of the church. If I screamed? "If you scream," he said, as if reading my thoughts, "I'll say that you had a nervous breakdown. that you're not in condition to get married today. Do you want that? Do you want your fiancé, your parents, the whole town to think that you've gone crazy?" I remained silent, paralyzed. He continued, "This won't take long. I just want to make sure that you're pure for your husband. It's an old custom, you know. God's representative needs to verify." While he spoke, he began to fiddle with the back of my dress, looking for the buttons that closed it. I felt his cold hands on my skin, and a shiver of terror ran through me. It was as if I was trapped in a nightmare, one of those where you try to scream, but your voice doesn't come out. "Please, don't do this," I begged, with tears already streaming down my face. "My father, my fiancé." "They can't help you now," he cut in, with a harsher voice. "Nobody questions a pastor in this town. Nobody." That's when I heard the first button break. Those pearl buttons that my mother had sewn with so much love, one by one. The sound of them falling on the tiled floor was like a shot in the silence of that bathroom. And then another, and one more. I can't describe in detail what happened in those minutes that seemed like an eternity. How could I translate into words the horror of being violated not only in body, but in soul, by someone who was supposed to represent the sacred? How to explain the feeling of my dream dress being torn, destroyed, while I begged a God who seemed to have abandoned me at that moment? What I can say is that while that man humiliated me with his hands and words, I transported myself to another place. In my mind, I was in the backyard of my parents' house, under the apple tree, feeling the smell of the approaching rain. It was as if my soul had fled, leaving only an empty body in that cold bathroom. "Now you are truly purified," he said when he finished, adjusting his clothes as if nothing had happened. "Empty of sin, ready for your husband." I was lying on the floor, trying to cover my body with the remains of the dress, crying silently. I couldn't even look at him. I felt disgust, shame, a despair so great that I could barely breathe. "Get dressed and return to the altar," he ordered. "If you say a word about this to anyone, I'll destroy you and your family. Nobody will believe you against a pastor. Nobody." With that, he unlocked the door and left, leaving me alone in that bathroom that would forever be the scene of my worst nightmare. I heard his footsteps moving away down the corridor, returning to the altar, as if he was going to resume the ceremony normally. I stayed there, on the floor, for a few moments that seemed like hours. How could I get out of there? How could I return to the altar, to Michael, to all those guests in that state? My dress was destroyed, my face marked by crying, my soul in pieces. But then something inside me, perhaps the same spirit that made my mother create beauty with her hands, or my father work from sunrise to sunset to support us, gave me strength to get up. I couldn't stay there forever. I needed to get out. I needed help. With trembling hands, I tried to fix what remained of the dress. The pearl buttons were scattered on the floor. I tried to pick up some, but they slipped from my fingers wet with tears. The bodice was torn at the back, the skirt wrinkled. The veil had been torn off and thrown in the corner. I looked in the small mirror above the sink. My face was unrecognizable. The lipstick smeared, the eyes red and swollen, the makeup that the girls had done with so much care, completely ruined. I put a little water on my face, trying to improve my appearance, but it was useless. There was no way to hide what had happened. At that moment, I heard a noise coming from the church. It was the organ playing again. Pastor Luke must have returned to the altar and restarted the ceremony as if nothing had happened. He probably told everyone that I was getting ready, touching up my makeup, having a moment of prayer before the final vows. And they would believe him, of course. Why wouldn't they believe the pastor? It was then that I made a decision. I couldn't return to the altar like that, but I also couldn't stay hidden there forever. I needed help. I needed to tell what had happened, even if nobody believed it, even if it meant the end of my wedding, of my reputation, of my life as I knew it. I took a deep breath, held the remains of the dress as best I could to cover my body, and opened the bathroom door. The corridor was deserted, which was a relief. I could hear, in the distance, Pastor Luke's voice in the church, speaking into the microphone, probably inventing some excuse for my delay. I walked slowly down the corridor, trying to think of what to do. If I entered the church from the back, everyone would see me in that state. If I tried to leave through the side door, I might meet someone on the way. I had no option. I needed to pass through the vestry and find help. When I reached the vestry door, I stopped. On the other side was the church full of people, Michael waiting, my parents, the guests, and him. How could I face them? How would I explain what had happened? It was in this moment of total despair that I felt a hand touch my shoulder. I turned, startled, ready to defend myself. It was Susan, my maid of honor, my friend. "Eleanor, my God in heaven, what happened to you?" she exclaimed, bringing her hands to her mouth upon seeing the state I was in. "Susan," was all I managed to say before collapsing in tears in her arms. "It was him, wasn't it?" she asked, with a voice that mixed horror and an understanding that surprised me. "It was Pastor Luke. He hurt you?" I nodded, unable to put into words what had happened. Susan hugged me tightly, then moved away and looked into my eyes. "Listen, Eleanor, you're not the first. I've heard stories, but never thought he would do this on your wedding day, in the church." I was shocked. Not the first? There were others? Why didn't anyone say anything? Why didn't anyone do anything? "What do I do now, Susan?" I asked, desperate. "I can't go back there like this. I can't face everyone." Michael needs to know," she said firmly. "My brother loves you. He'll stand by your side. But we can't expose you like this. Come, let's go out through the side door. My car is outside." "But the ceremony, the guests, that doesn't matter now, Eleanor. Your safety and your well-being are more important than any ceremony." She took off the jacket she was wearing over her maid of honor dress and put it around my shoulders, trying to cover as much as possible of the damage to my dress. "Come, let's go out this way." We started walking towards the side door of the vestry. It was a small exit, used mainly by the altar boys and church staff. If we could reach it without being seen, perhaps we would have a chance. But when we were about to reach the door, I heard a noise. It was the main door of the vestry opening. I turned and saw Pastor Luke standing in the doorway. His face contorted into an expression of anger when he saw us. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, with a controlled voice but full of threat. "The ceremony isn't over. The bride needs to return to the altar." Susan positioned herself in front of me like a shield. "She's not going anywhere with you. Look what you did to her. You monster!" The pastor took a step in our direction. His eyes were dark, like bottomless wells. "Be careful what you say, young lady. You're accusing a man of God. That's a serious sin." "The serious sin is what you just did," Susan replied, not backing down. "And don't think this is going to be left like this. We're going to tell everyone." The pastor laughed, a cold sound without humor. "And who will believe you? A hysterical bride and her friend? Against the word of a pastor respected by the whole town?" He was right, and that destroyed me inside. Who would believe us? How would we prove what had happened in that bathroom? It was our word against his, and in the hierarchy of credibility, we were far below. "Michael will believe," said Susan, but her voice no longer had the same conviction. "Ah, yes, your brother." The pastor smiled again. "The devout Michael, who grew up respecting the church and its representatives. He's going to believe that the man who baptized him, who gave him his first communion, who heard his confessions throughout his life, abused his bride? Or will he think that she panicked, tore her own dress in a nervous breakdown, and made up this story to hide her madness?" Each word of his was like a knife, because deep down I knew he might be right. Michael was a good man, but he was also a man of unwavering faith. How would he react to such an accusation against a pastor? Would he believe me, or would he think I had gone crazy? "Now be reasonable," continued Pastor Luke, in a more conciliatory tone. Let's forget this little incident. The bride had a moment of nervousness, tore the dress, but nothing we can't fix. We'll say it was an accident. We can continue the ceremony, and nobody needs to know what really happened here. Never, I replied, finding my voice for the first time since he entered the vestry. I will never let you get near me again. He narrowed his eyes, all the false kindness disappearing. Then you're choosing the hard way. Think carefully, Eleanor. Think about the scandal, the shame for your family, for Michael. Think about what people will say when they know that the bride had a nervous breakdown on the wedding day and made up accusations against the pastor. At that moment, I heard another door open. It was the door that led directly to the church, and there, standing with an expression of confusion that soon turned into horror, was Michael. "Eleanor," he said, looking at me, at the state of my dress, at the tears on my face. "My God, what happened to you?" Time seemed to freeze when Michael entered the vestry. His eyes scanned my torn dress, my face marked by tears, the despair etched in every inch of my being. I saw the confusion in his look, then the concern, and finally, something I had never seen before, a deep, primal anger. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, but trembling slightly. His eyes went from me to Pastor Luke and back to me. Before I could answer, the pastor stepped forward, assuming that paternal and concerned posture that I already knew all too well. "Michael, my son," he began, "your bride is having a difficult moment. A nervous breakdown, understandable on the wedding day. She tore her own dress and was trying to flee from the church. Your sister and I were trying to calm her down." Michael looked at Susan, who immediately shook her head. "That's a lie," she said firmly. "Michael, don't believe him." The pastor sighed, as if he was dealing with stubborn children. "You see, the bride is clearly disturbed, and your sister is just trying to protect her. But I think we need to call a doctor, perhaps postpone the ceremony." "He hurt me, Michael," I finally managed to say, my voice almost a whisper. "He took me to a bathroom at the back of the church. He said he needed to purify me before the vows. He tore my dress. He touched me." I couldn't continue. The words got stuck in my throat, suffocated by the shame and horror of the still so recent memory. Michael's face turned pale, but the pastor was quick to respond. "See? Delusions, absurd accusations from a panicking mind," he said, now with indignation in his voice. "Michael, you've known me since you were a boy. I baptized you, gave you your first communion. How can you believe that I would be capable of something so repugnant?" I saw the doubt on my fiancé's face. The pastor was a respected man, a figure of spiritual authority in his life. And me? I was just a girl who came from another town, whom he had known for just over a year. "Michael, please," I begged, extending my hand to him. "I would never lie about something like this. Why would I want to ruin our wedding? Why would I destroy the dress that my mother made with so much love? I was so happy this morning." Michael looked at my outstretched hand, then at the pastor, and then back at me. I could see the battle happening inside him, the faith of a lifetime against his love for me. That's when the pastor decided to deliver the final blow. "Michael, I understand your confusion, but think, we have witnesses. People in the church saw the bride enter with me into the vestry for the signing of the documents, perfectly normal and calm. What happened afterward? Only God knows what went through her mind. Perhaps the stress, perhaps a more serious problem." He lowered his voice as if confiding something. "You know, I heard rumors about her family. Her mother has problems, imbalances. These things are sometimes hereditary." That was like a slap in the face. He was insinuating that my mother, my sweet and talented mother, was crazy, and that I had inherited this madness. The audacity of that man had no limits. "That's a lie," I screamed, with a strength that I didn't know I still had. My mother is the sanest and kindest woman in the world. You don't know her. You have no right to talk about her like that. The pastor smiled, as if my outburst only proved his point. See how agitated she gets, Michael? That's what I'm talking about. Emotional instability. That's when Susan, who until then was by my side, stepped forward and faced her brother. Michael, look at me. Look into my eyes and tell me, do you really think Eleanor would be capable of making something like this up? Of tearing her own wedding dress? Of ruining the day she dreamed of her whole life? Michael looked at his sister, then at me, and then at the pastor. I could see the internal struggle, the pain of the impossible decision. And there's more, continued Susan, now looking directly at the pastor. She's not the first, Michael. I've heard stories about Pastor Luke, whispers, rumors that nobody has the courage to speak out loud. Why do you think so many girls refuse to confess with him? Why do so many mothers not let their daughters go alone to Bible study? The pastor's expression changed. The confident smile gave way to something harder, more threatening. Be careful what you say, girl. Defamation is a serious sin, and it's also a crime. It's not defamation if it's the truth, Susan replied, not retreating an inch. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with tension. Michael was motionless, like a statue, looking from the pastor to me and to his sister. It was then that we heard a noise coming from the church. People were getting restless with the delay. Someone called Michael's name, probably one of the groomsmen coming to check what was happening. The pastor took advantage of the opportunity. We need to resolve this now. The guests are waiting. Michael, what will it be? Shall we continue the ceremony, or... He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. It was a choice between proceeding with the wedding, pretending that nothing had happened, or believing me and facing the consequences. The scandal, the accusations, the disbelief of the community. Michael finally moved. He took a step in my direction, hesitated, then took another. My heart was racing. This was the moment of truth. Would he believe me or the pastor? When he got close enough, he extended his hand and gently touched my face, where a red mark was beginning to appear, a result of the force with which the pastor had held my face when I tried to resist. I know you, Eleanor, he said softly. I know your heart. You wouldn't lie about something like this. The tears I had been holding finally overflowed. The relief of being believed, of not being abandoned, was overwhelming. Michael turned to the pastor, and his expression changed completely. The gentle and respectful man I knew gave way to someone I had never seen before, someone with fury in his eyes and determination on his face. If you touched her, he said, with a voice I barely recognized, if you did a tenth of what she's saying, I swear to God I'll... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The threat was clear in every syllable, in every tense muscle of his body. The pastor took a step back, for the first time seeming insecure. Think carefully about what you're doing, Michael. Think of your family, your position in the community. Who will believe you? Who will stand against the church? It was at this moment that the vestry door opened again. I thought it would be one of the groomsmen, or perhaps my father, coming to look for us. But it wasn't. It was Mrs. Sarah Thompson, Michael's mother. She entered silently, as she always did, with her rosary in her hands, and that expression that I now recognized not as resignation, but as a deep and old suffering. "What's happening here?" she asked, with a surprisingly firm voice for a woman who rarely spoke above a whisper. Her eyes scanned the scene. Me with the torn dress, Michael with fury stamped on his face, Susan by my side, the pastor cornered against the wall. "Mother," Michael began, "you need to leave here. We're resolving a problem." "What problem could be so serious as to interrupt a wedding?" she asked, looking directly at me. There was no judgment in her look, only a deep and disturbing understanding. The pastor, I tried to explain, but the words failed me again. Mrs. Sarah, Pastor Luke quickly intervened. Your future daughter-in-law is having a nervous breakdown. She made absurd accusations against me. Your son, unfortunately, seems inclined to believe her. Perhaps you, with your wisdom, can help him see reason. Michael's mother looked long at the pastor. Her face, normally expressionless, began to change. I saw something emerge in those tired eyes, a spark, a fire that must have been dormant for decades. Absurd accusations? She repeated slowly. What kind of accusations, Pastor? She says he took her to a bathroom at the back of the church, Susan explained quickly. That he tore her dress and hurt her. Mrs. Sarah remained motionless for a long moment. Then, to my complete astonishment, she nodded slightly. Yes, she said, with a voice that seemed to come from very far away. The bathroom at the back. I know it. The pastor visibly paled. Mrs. Sarah, please, you cannot— Yes, I can, she interrupted him, with a firmness that seemed impossible coming from that fragile and quiet woman. I can, and I will. I've been silent for too long. She turned to her son. Michael, I believe her. Because this man's father did the same thing in my time. A stunning silence fell over the vestry. Mrs. Sarah's revelation was like a lightning bolt that illuminated a landscape long shrouded in darkness. Mother? Michael whispered, shocked. What are you talking about? Mrs. Sarah looked directly at Pastor Luke, without fear, without hesitation. Your father, the old Pastor Sullivan, did the same thing to brides, in the same bathroom, with the same words about purification. I know because I was one of them. On the day of my wedding to your father. She turned to Michael. I never told anyone, not even your father. I carried this shame alone for 30 years. I remained silent. I prayed. I asked God to truly purify me, and I swore I would protect other women. But I failed. I failed because I was afraid, because no one would believe me against a man of God. Silent tears streamed down Mrs. Sarah's wrinkled face. Michael was in shock, completely speechless. Susan had her hands over her mouth, horrified, and I felt a mixture of horror at the revelation and a strange comfort for not being alone, for being believed. Pastor Luke seemed to have shrunk. The arrogance, the confidence that he would get away with it as he always had, all of this had disappeared from his face. Lie, he said, but his voice trembled. All lies. You have no proof. We don't need proof, Mrs. Sarah replied with surprising calm. We just need the courage to speak the truth. And I've found mine, finally. It was at this moment that we heard more voices approaching. The vestry door opened again, and this time it was my father, accompanied by Michael's father and some guests. What's happening here? My father asked, concerned. Then his eyes landed on me, on the state of my dress, on my face marked by tears. My daughter, what did they do to you? Pastor Luke tried one last time. She had a nervous breakdown, sir. She tore her own dress and is making absurd accusations. Shut up, shouted Michael, advancing a step in the pastor's direction. Don't dare speak that way about my bride. My father ran to me, took off his jacket and put it over my shoulders, trying to cover me, to protect me, although it was too late for that. Who did this to you, daughter? He asked, with a voice trembling with anger and concern. I looked at the pastor, then at Michael, at Susan, at Mrs. Sarah. Suddenly I felt stronger, less alone. Perhaps it was possible to speak the truth and be heard. Perhaps it was possible to break the cycle of silence and shame. It was him, Dad, I answered, pointing to Pastor Luke. He took me to a bathroom at the back of the church. He tore my dress. He hurt me. My father looked at the pastor, and I saw in his eyes a fury that I had never witnessed before. I remembered what he told me before I left Millfield. Trust your heart first before trusting any person, even if that person wears a clerical collar. He knew. Somehow, he knew of the dangers. He began, taking a step in the direction of the pastor. What happened next was so fast that I barely had time to process. Michael, who was closer, didn't wait. With a movement that no one predicted, he advanced against Pastor Luke and hit him with a punch to the face. The pastor staggered backward, hitting against the vestry wall, an expression of absolute shock on his face. "Michael!" shouted his father, running to hold his son before he delivered another blow. "What are you doing? He's a pastor!" "He's a monster!" shouted Michael, fighting against his father's grip. "Ask my mother. Ask her what this man's father did to brides." Michael's father looked stupefied, passing his gaze from his son to his wife. "Sarah? What is he talking about? What story is this?" Mrs. Sarah was upright now, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She walked until she stood next to her son and put a hand on his shoulder. "It's true, George," she said to her husband. "This man's father, the old Pastor Sullivan, did to me the same thing that his son just did to this poor girl. On the day of our wedding, 30 years ago, he took me to the same bathroom, spoke the same words about purification. And I never had the courage to tell you. I never had the courage to tell anyone." The room fell into a heavy silence. Mr. George looked at his wife as if he was seeing a stranger. "Why did you never tell me anything, Sarah? For all these years?" "Shame," she replied, her voice trembling a little. "Fear. Who would believe me? He was the most respected pastor in the diocese. And each time I needed to go to church, each time we needed to participate in some ceremony, there he was, with that smile, reminding me of my silence, of my secret." Mrs. Sarah then turned to Pastor Luke, and her voice gained an impressive firmness. "When your father died, Luke, I thought that nightmare had ended, that other girls would be safe. But then you returned from Boston to take his place. And the first time I saw you looking at a young woman, I recognized that same look. The same eyes as your father. And I knew you were just like him." Pastor Luke seemed to have aged 10 years in the last few minutes. His arrogance had completely disappeared, replaced by a growing panic as more people entered the vestry, attracted by the commotion. "This woman is crazy," he said, but his voice no longer had the firmness of before. "All this is a conspiracy against me, against the church." "No, it's not," said another voice coming from the vestry door. Everyone turned and saw an elderly lady leaning on a cane whom I recognized as Mrs. Martha, the church organist. "I went through it too," she continued, looking directly at Mrs. Sarah. "At my wedding, in 1942, with old Pastor Sullivan. That's why I never had children, because after that day, I never again wanted any man to touch me, not even my husband." A murmur ran through the vestry, which was now full of people. Another woman, younger, stepped forward. 3 years ago, she said, at my pre-wedding confession, with Pastor Luke. And then, it was as if a dam had broken. More voices, more stories, more courage found in the testimony of others. Years and years of silence, shame, and pain finally being exposed to the light. Pastor Luke backed up to the wall, his eyes wide like a cornered animal. "This is a nightmare," he muttered. "This can't be happening." Amid the tumult, I felt Michael's hand holding mine. He gently pulled me out of that circle of people to a calmer corner of the vestry. "Eleanor," he said, looking directly into my eyes, "forgive me. Forgive me for having hesitated, even if for a second. Forgive me for not having protected you." I shook my head, unable to speak. There was nothing to forgive. He had believed in me when it would have been much easier not to believe, when all the weight of tradition and authority was against me. "Do you still want to marry me?" he asked, with a voice so soft that I could barely hear in the midst of the confusion forming in the vestry. "Not today, of course. Not here. But someday, when you're ready. If you still want to." I looked at that man, at the love and concern in his eyes, and felt something breaking inside me. It wasn't my heart. That was already broken by what had just happened. It was the fear, the shame, the feeling that I was dirty, that no one would accept me after what had happened. All of this dissolved before that look. "Yes," I answered, surprised by the firmness of my own voice. "Yes, I still want to marry you, Michael." He smiled, a sad smile but full of promise, and hugged me carefully, as if I were made of porcelain. My father approached us, his face a mask of pain and concern. "Let's go home, daughter," he said. "Your mother is waiting outside, worried. We need to take care of you." I nodded, allowing them to guide me out of the vestry, away from that chaotic scene, away from Pastor Luke and the memories of what had happened in the bathroom. My father's jacket still covered my shoulders, hiding the damage to my wedding dress, but nothing could hide the damage to my soul. When we passed through the door that led to the nave of the church, I saw that it was almost empty. Most of the guests had already gone or were crowded at the entrance to the vestry, trying to understand what was happening. The few who remained in the pews looked at me with expressions that ranged from curiosity to pity. My mother ran to meet us, her face marked by tears. "My daughter!" she exclaimed, enveloping me in a tight hug. "What happened? Why did the ceremony stop? Why are you wearing your father's jacket?" I couldn't answer. The words got stuck in my throat. How to explain to my mother the horror I had lived, how to stain her ears with that story. It was Michael who spoke, with a controlled voice but loaded with emotion. "Mrs. Alice, there was an incident. Eleanor was attacked by the pastor." My mother turned pale, a hand going to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "No, it can't be." "It's true, Mom," I finally managed to say. "He took me to a bathroom at the back of the church. He tore my dress. I couldn't finish, but it wasn't necessary. My mother understood, and I saw in her eyes the same pain that I felt in my heart. She hugged me again, stronger this time, as if she wanted to protect me retroactively, to erase what had happened. "Let's go home," she said firmly. "Right now." And so, surrounded by those who truly loved me, my parents, Michael, Susan, I left St. Christopher's Cathedral that Saturday afternoon. Not as a happy bride, arm in arm with her husband, under a shower of rice and blessings, but as a survivor, carrying a wound that would take time to heal, but also a strength that I didn't know I had. What I couldn't imagine at that moment, as I entered my father's car and looked for the last time at the church where my dream had turned into a nightmare, was that that day marked not only the end of an innocence, but also the beginning of a silent revolution in Charlottesville. A revolution led by women who, like Mrs. Sarah, Mrs. Martha, and so many others, had kept their secrets for too long, and now, finally, found their voices. In the days that followed that fateful Saturday, I locked myself in the room I occupied in my brother Oliver's house. I didn't want to see anyone. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I felt shame, disgust, anger, a whirlwind of emotions that consumed me from within. My mother stayed in Charlottesville to take care of me, sitting beside my bed, trying to convince me to eat, to drink water, to take a bath. But I could barely move. "Daughter," she would say, running her hand through my hair as she did when I was a child. "What happened to you was terrible, but it wasn't your fault. You did nothing wrong." I knew this, deep in my soul, but the rational knowledge didn't alleviate the pain, the feeling of violation that seemed impregnated in my skin. No matter how much I scrubbed, no matter how much I tried to forget, the memory of those hands, that voice, that cold bathroom haunted me. Michael came every day, but I refused to see him. Not because I was angry with him. I never was. He had believed in me. He had defended me. But I couldn't face him. How could I look into the eyes of the man I loved after what had happened? How could I be his wife, his companion, when I felt so broken? It was Susan who finally managed to get me out of that state. On the fourth day after the incident, she entered my room without asking permission, opened the curtains, letting the sunlight enter for the first time in days, and sat on the edge of my bed. "Eleanor," she said, with that frankness that was so characteristic of her, "I know you're suffering, and you have every right to suffer. But there's something happening in the city that you need to know." I turned my back to her, pulling the blanket over my head. I didn't want to know anything that was happening in the city. I just wanted to disappear, to hide from the world forever. "Pastor Luke has been removed," she continued, ignoring my attempt to isolate myself. "The bishop of the diocese came personally from Richmond when he heard what happened. There was an internal investigation, and he was sent to a spiritual retreat, which is what they call it when they want to hide a pastor who caused problems." This caught my attention. I sat up in bed, still wrapped in the blanket, looking at Susan for the first time in days. "They removed him?" I asked, my voice hoarse from so much crying and little use. "But how? Why? I thought nobody would believe." "That's just it," Susan smiled, a sad smile but full of a kind of satisfaction. "After what happened in the vestry, after Mrs. Sarah spoke, it was like a floodgate had opened. More than 20 women from Charlottesville came forward. 20, Eleanor. Some suffered abuse from Pastor Luke, others from his father. Some were brides, like you and Mrs. Sarah. Others were just girls in Bible study." I remained silent, processing the information. 20 women, 20 lives marked by the same kind of horror that I had lived. The idea was at the same time devastating and somehow comforting. I wasn't alone. I wasn't the only one. It wasn't because there was something wrong with me, something that provoked that violence. "The bishop tried to cover up the case, of course," continued Susan. "He talked about discretion, about protecting the reputation of the church. But Mrs. Sarah didn't let him. You know what she did? She went to the Charlottesville Gazette and told everything. Everything. Your name appeared in the newspaper, Eleanor, as the bride who was abused by the pastor on her wedding day." I felt a shiver run down my spine. My name in the newspaper. My story exposed for all to read, for all to know. But why? Why would she do that? I asked, feeling a mixture of horror and something approaching admiration. "Because she said she was tired of secrets," Susan replied. "Tired of silence, tired of protecting men who don't deserve protection." And you know what happened after the article came out? The mayor was pressured to speak out. The police were forced to open an investigation. And other women, from other cities, began to tell similar stories about other pastors. I remained silent again, trying to absorb what she was telling me. It was as if a small revolution was happening in Charlottesville, a revolution triggered by the horror I experienced in that vestry. "And there's more," said Susan, taking my hand. "Michael's mother is organizing a support group for women who went through what you went through, what she went through. A safe place to talk, to share, to heal. She wants you to participate when you're ready." I looked at our joined hands, at Susan's fingers intertwined with mine. For the first time in days, I felt something beyond shame and pain. I felt a small spark of hope, of purpose. "And Michael?" I asked, finally giving voice to the question that tormented me. "How is he?" Susan's face softened. "He's suffering for you, Eleanor. He loves you so much. He wants to see you, wants to help you, but respects your space, your time. He said he'll wait as long as necessary, that he's not in a hurry." Tears began to stream down my face, but they were different from the tears of recent days. They weren't tears of despair, of shame. They were tears of relief, of gratitude. "I want to see him," I said, surprising myself with the sudden decision. "Not today. I'm still not presentable. But tomorrow." "Can you tell him to come tomorrow?" Susan smiled, squeezing my hand. "Of course I can. He'll be so happy, Eleanor." That night, for the first time since the incident, I agreed to have dinner with my mother and my brother in the dining room instead of eating alone in the bedroom. I was far from being well, far from being cured. But something had begun to change within me. The idea that my pain, my horrible experience, had somehow triggered a larger movement that could help other women gave me a kind of strength that I didn't know I needed. The next day, I took a long shower, letting the hot water wash not only the dirt from my body, but also, symbolically, a bit of the shame that had consumed me. I put on a simple but clean outfit. I combed my hair, looked in the mirror. The woman who looked back at me was pale, with deep, dark circles, thinner than a week ago. But her eyes had a gleam that wasn't there before, a gleam of determination, of newly discovered strength. When Michael arrived, he was nervous, insecure, clearly worried about saying or doing something wrong. We sat in the living room, with my mother discreetly present in the kitchen, giving us privacy, but maintaining the propriety that the customs of the time required. "How are you?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the sofa, as if he was ready to flee at the slightest sign that his presence bothered me. "I'm surviving," I answered honestly. "One day at a time." He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "Susan told me about the group that my mother is organizing, about the newspaper, the police investigation." "Yes," I said, feeling a warmth in my chest when thinking of Mrs. Sarah, that quiet woman who had found her voice in such a powerful way. "Your mother is amazing, Michael." "She is," he agreed, a small smile appearing on his face. "I've never seen her like this, you know? So strong, so determined. It's as if she had awakened from a long sleep." "My father is scared," he laughed, a genuine laugh that lit a small flame within me. "He said he married one woman and now is living with another." I laughed too, a strange sound after so many days of tears. "I hope he's enjoying the new version." "He's loving it," Michael answered, his eyes shining. "He says he fell in love with her again." We remained silent for a moment, a comfortable silence, different from the oppressive silence that had enveloped me in recent days. "And us, Eleanor?" Michael finally asked, his voice low, careful. "What happens with us now?" I took a deep breath, thinking about the answer. A week ago, I was preparing to become this man's wife. Now everything had changed. I had changed. "I don't know, Michael," I answered honestly. "I don't know if I can be the wife you deserve, that you expected to have. I don't know if I'll ever completely overcome what happened. But I know that I still love you. That hasn't changed." He extended his hand slowly, giving me time to retreat if I wanted to. I didn't retreat. I let him take my hand, let him intertwine his fingers with mine, just as Susan had done the day before. "I'm not in a hurry," he said, with a firmness that surprised me. "We can wait. A month, a year, the time you need. And when, if, you decide you're ready, it won't be in the church. It will be your way, where you feel safe." Tears appeared in my eyes again. How could I be so lucky in the midst of so much misfortune? How could I have found a man like this, who understood, who respected, who would wait? "Thank you," was all I managed to say. The weeks that followed were an emotional roller coaster. The police investigation continued, with more women coming forward each day to give testimony. The case gained repercussion beyond Charlottesville, appearing in the newspapers of Richmond, then of Washington, D.C., of New York. Journalists came to the city, wanting interviews, photos, stories. I refused all interviews initially. I wasn't ready to speak publicly about what had happened. But I participated in the support group organized by Mrs. Sarah. Hearing the stories of other women, some older than my mother, others younger than me, was at the same time devastating and healing. There was so much suffering in that room, so much pain kept for so long. But there was also an impressive strength, a resilience that inspired me every day. It was in one of these meetings that I met Rachel, a journalist from Roanoke who had come to cover the case. Unlike the other journalists, she wasn't interested only in the sordid details. She wanted to understand the movement that was being born, the impact on women, on the community. She herself had a story of abuse to share, although it didn't involve the church. "What you're doing here is revolutionary," she told me one day after a meeting of the group. "You're challenging not just some pastors, but an entire system that protects abusers, that silences victims." "I don't feel like a revolutionary," I replied, with a small smile. "I just feel like someone trying to survive, trying to make sense of what happened." "Sometimes that's how revolutions begin," she said, with a seriousness that made me reflect. "With ordinary people trying to survive, trying to make sense of their suffering." It was Rachel who convinced me to finally tell my story, not to seek the spotlight or fame, but to help other women who might be going through the same thing. To show that it was possible to survive, that it was possible to speak, that it was possible to find support. The article she wrote, published first in the Roanoke Times and then reproduced in other vehicles across the country, didn't mention just the horror of what had happened in the church bathroom. It also talked about the support group, about Mrs. Sarah's courage, about the movement that was growing not only in Charlottesville, but in other cities, as more women found the courage to speak. 6 months after the incident, the police investigation was concluded. Pastor Luke was indicted for crimes against me and against 12 other women who had the courage to give formal testimony. His father, already deceased, couldn't be judged, but his name was stained forever, his memory unmasked. The church tried everything to cover up the case, to protect its image. It offered financial compensation to the victims in exchange for silence, tried to transfer Pastor Luke to another parish instead of handing him over to justice, went so far as to suggest that all those women were lying, making up stories for revenge or to gain notoriety. But it was too late. The truth had already come to light, and there was no way to put it back in the box. Pastor Luke ended up being tried and convicted, although the penalty was lighter than many of us would have liked. The church was forced to acknowledge the abuses, to offer formal apologies, to promise changes in protection policies. In the meantime, Michael and I continued together, although not married. He waited, patient, loving, never pressuring me. We worked together in the movement that was being born, he being one of the few male voices to rise in defense of women, to believe in the stories, to demand justice. A year after the day that should have been our wedding, he proposed to me again. We were by the banks of the Rivanna River, the same place where he had proposed to me the first time. But we were different people now. Stronger, more aware, more committed not only to each other, but to the fight for justice that had become part of our lives. "Do you still want to marry me, Eleanor Jenkins?" he asked, holding my hands in his. I looked at him, at the man who had been by my side in the most difficult moments, who had believed in me when it would have been easier not to believe, who had waited patiently while I struggled to find my strength again. "Yes," I answered without hesitation. "Yes, Michael, I want to marry you." We got married in a simple ceremony in the backyard of Michael's parents' house. There was no church, no pastor. It was a justice of the peace who conducted the ceremony under an arch of flowers that Susan and my friends from the support group had prepared. My mother made a new dress for me, not white and pompous like the first, but a simple dress, light blue, which she said matched the color of hope. Mrs. Sarah was my matron of honor, a symbolic gesture that meant a lot to both of us. She was no longer the quiet and resigned woman that I had met a year before. She was a leader, a powerful voice for women who had long been silenced. When the justice of the peace declared us husband and wife, and Michael softly kissed me on the lips, I felt a wave of gratitude so intense that it almost knocked me down. Gratitude not for what had happened. I would never feel gratitude for that horror, but for the strength I had found afterward, for the people who had supported me, for the movement that had been born from my pain. 3 months after our wedding, Michael was transferred by the bank to a branch in Seabreeze, on the coast of North Carolina. It was a difficult decision to leave Charlottesville, to leave the support group, the movement that had become so important to me. But it was also a relief, a chance to start again, away from the memories, away from the looks of pity, away from the church where everything had happened. Before we left, I had a final meeting with the support group. Women who had become my friends, my sisters in pain and in healing. "I'm not abandoning you," I said, with tears in my eyes. "I'm not abandoning the fight. I just need this new beginning." "You deserve it, Eleanor," replied Mrs. Sarah, hugging me tightly. "You've given so much of yourself to all of us. Now it's time to live your life, to be happy. And I'll continue the fight in Seabreeze," I promised. "I'll take what I learned here, what we built together. I'll help other women there, just as you helped me here." And that's what I did. Upon arriving in Seabreeze, a small and peaceful city by the sea, I found a new purpose. With Michael's support, I created a support group similar to the one in Charlottesville. In the beginning, we were just 3 or 4 women meeting in the living room of my house. But with time, the group grew. The stories were different. Not all involved the church, but the pain, the need to speak, to be heard, to find support, were the same. The movement that had begun in a vestry in Charlottesville, with the courage of a humiliated bride and the long-silenced voice of a mother-in-law, continued to grow, to expand, to touch more lives. And I, who had felt so broken, so destroyed in that cold bathroom, found in shared pain, in collective struggle, a strength that I never knew I had. Today, almost 60 years after that day at St. Christopher's Cathedral, I live a peaceful life here in Seabreeze. Our house is a few blocks from the beach. A simple little house, painted light blue, with a porch where I spend most mornings, sitting in my rocking chair, listening to the sound of the sea and the singing of birds. Michael and I had a good life together. It wasn't perfect, no life is, but it was full of love, respect, companionship. He worked at the bank until he retired, almost 20 years ago. I, after overcoming the initial trauma, went back to study nursing and worked at the small-town hospital for more than 3 decades. It was a job that gave me purpose, that allowed me to help people in their moments of vulnerability, something that became very important to me after what I lived through. We had 2 children, Henry, who is now 56 years old and is a doctor in Wilmington, and Clara, 53, who is a teacher right here in Seabreeze. Raising them was one of the greatest joys of my life, although it was also a challenge. It took me years to completely overcome the fear of touch, to feel comfortable in intimacy. Michael was patient, caring, never pressured me. It was a slow process of healing, of rediscovery of my own body, not as an object of shame, but as a source of strength and eventually pleasure. Our children grew up knowing our story. Not the sordid details, of course, but the essence of what happened and how we transformed that pain into something positive, into a movement that helped other women. I think this shaped who they became. Henry is known for his work with women victims of violence. Clara founded a program of sex education and abuse prevention in the schools where she teaches. I have 6 wonderful grandchildren who fill my house with noise and joy when they come to visit us. The oldest, Henry's son, is already in law school. The youngest, Clara's daughter, is only 8 years old and is the joy of my days. She loves to sit with me on the porch, listening to stories from the old times, as she says. Sometimes I ask her to get my photo album, and together we look at the images that tell the story of our family. There is one photo in particular that always moves me, a black and white photograph of my wedding to Michael. I'm not in white, but in light blue. We are under the flower arch in his parents' backyard, surrounded by people who loved us. The smile on my face is small, still hesitant, but genuine. It was the smile of someone who was beginning to believe in the possibility of happiness again. "Why aren't you in white, Grandma?" little Beatrice sometimes asks me. "All brides wear white." "Not all of them, my love," I reply, caressing her hair. "Some brides choose other colors, colors that have special meaning for them. Of course, one day when she's older, I'll tell her the true story. Like her grandmothers before her, she will grow up knowing about the abuse, about the silence, about the courage needed to speak. It's a heavy knowledge to pass on, but it's also a shield, an armor to protect her in a world that isn't always kind to women." The support group that I started here in Seabreeze still exists, although it has evolved over the years. Today, it's a formal organization with volunteer professionals, psychologists, social workers, lawyers, offering help to women victims of various types of violence. I'm no longer actively involved in the administration. I pass that torch to younger women with more energy. But I still participate in the meetings when I can, still offer my story, my experience. Michael passed away 5 years ago. It was a loss that almost destroyed me again, after more than 50 years together. He left peacefully, during sleep, without suffering, a blessing. In the last years of his life, I used to wake up in the middle of the night and stay watching his breathing, fearing the moment that I knew would eventually come. When it finally happened, even being prepared, I felt as if a part of me had been torn out. But life goes on, doesn't it? I learned that in the hardest way, back in that cold bathroom of St. Christopher's Cathedral, so many years ago. I learned that no matter how bad the pain is, how deep the wound is, there is a tomorrow. And in that tomorrow, we can choose to remain victims or become survivors. We can choose silence or find our voice. I have regular contact with Mrs. Sarah, who is now 97 years old and still lives in Charlottesville, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. We talk on the phone every week, and with each conversation, I marvel at the strength of that woman who was once so quiet, so faded, and who found her voice and her power at the moment I needed it most. Susan also remained a constant presence in my life. After all these years, she is still my best friend, my confidant. She lives in Raleigh now, is a widow like me, and we're planning a trip together to the West Coast next month, our first big adventure without our husbands. The movement that began in that vestry in Charlottesville grew, expanded, and transformed over the decades. Today there are support groups like ours in hundreds of cities across America. Laws were created, policies were implemented, society evolved in its understanding and treatment of sexual abuse. Not as much as we would like, of course. There's still much to be done, much to be changed. But looking back, to the young 18-year-old bride whose dress was torn and whose life was turned upside down in that cold bathroom, I feel immense pride in the path traveled. Every day, when the sun begins to set over the sea of Seabreeze, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, I think about how blessed I am. Blessed not by what happened. I will never feel gratitude for that horror, but for having survived, for having found strength to continue, for having transformed my pain into something greater than myself. And every day before sleeping, I look at Michael's portrait on my bedside table and thank him for having believed in me when the whole world was against me, for having given me time and space to heal, for having been the gentle and loving companion that he was for more than 5 decades. Good night, my love, I whisper to the portrait as I did when he was alive. And sometimes, in the moments between sleep and wakefulness, I can almost hear his response. Good night, my Eleanor. Rest well. Tomorrow will be a new day. And it is always a new day, isn't it? A new day to remember, to honor, to fight, to love, to live. A new day to be not just a survivor, but a complete woman, in all her strength and vulnerability. A woman who knew the worst of humanity, but also the best. A woman who lost much, but gained even more. A woman who, despite everything, never lost the capacity to love, to trust, to believe. That's who I am today, Eleanor Jenkins Thompson, 78 years old, widow, mother, grandmother, friend, counselor. A woman who knew hell and came back to tell the story. A woman who transformed her greatest shame into her greatest strength. A woman who, looking back on a long and full life, can say with certainty, it was worth it. Every tear, every struggle, every victory, it was worth it. My dears, I've shared with you one of the most difficult parts of my life. It's not easy to revisit these memories, but I believe that our scars, when shown in the light, help others find courage. If you're going through something similar, know this. It's not your fault. The shame doesn't belong to you, but to the aggressor. You are not alone. There are more people like you than you imagine, and together you can find strength. Healing is possible. I won't lie. It's not easy, it's not quick, but the wound that once bled constantly is today just a scar. Your voice is powerful. Abuse thrives in the shadows. Bringing it to light is the first step toward liberation. And remember, you deserve love, even with your wounds and fears. The greatest revenge against those who try to destroy us is to live fully. When that pastor tore my dress, he thought he was breaking me forever. He didn't know that from that humiliation would be born a strength that even I didn't know I had. My dears who have accompanied me this far, I need to ask an important favor. If this story touched your heart, please hit the subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. That way we can continue this chain of support and hope. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear this message. And in the comments, leave the word courage so I know you watched until the end and are with me in this fight. Do this now. Let's break the silence together.